Elite design, better comfort, more grip. Our new Pure Grip Socks Elite add engineered compression, an anti-blister base, and more grip to keep you locked in. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
The nostalgia merchants at Adidas Football have struck again, and boy are they doing a good job. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to one of two boots that make up the new F50 Archive Pack. This particular pair being a standard F50 Elite, but of course with colors and graphics that pay tribute to the OG F50 Adizero, this being one of three colorways that launched during the 2010 World Cup. With that OG F50 genuinely being one of the most iconic and influential football boots of all time. With the second boot in the pack being even more special in that it's a one-to-one upper remake of the leather F50 Adizero, again from the 2010 World Cup, paired up with the Sprint Frame 360 sole plate and stud pattern from the current F50 Elite. $260 for the yellow pair, which is the same price as a normal F50 Elite, and $280 for the leather remakes, which obviously isn't cheap, but only a $20 premium considering how good these are as a remake. When you consider that we were once upon a time paying $350 for Predator remakes, I'd actually say this is a pretty decent deal. With both boots coming with an extra set of insoles, along with this special graphic that of course pays tribute to the 2010 World Cup and all the accolades that the players wearing the F50 Adizero racked up. And even though the OGs didn't come with string bags, the remakes do. Yellow with the yellow boots, black with the black ones, small F50 with some cool graphics on the front, and big F50 on the back. These get a string bag rating of 1874 out of 2010.81. Where obviously we don't need to talk a lot about the normal F50 Elite. I think this yellow and black colorway looks absolutely fantastic, and if you're looking for just a great looking pair of the normal F50s, this is a must buy in my opinion. However, it's not very often we get a leather pair of F50s these days, and as far as one-to-one remakes go, this is probably the closest to the original we've ever seen from Adidas. Where obviously Adidas have done a really good job with upper remakes in the past, but given that they've paired it up with the modern F50 sole plate tooling, when compared to an OG, they actually have way more in common than I think a lot of people might expect. Where if you love these and would love to experience them again, you're going to love the remakes. And if you're eagle-eyed enough to notice that I switched which boot I had in which hand, then you really know your stuff, because this is the OG. We're gonna go over what the actual differences are between the remakes and the OGs, talk about how they fit and feel on feet, and ultimately conclude whether or not Adidas should consider bringing back a leather F50 permanently. So if you're interested in learning more, please stick around and watch the entire review. And if you are interested in a pair of these for yourself, I would recommend getting them before they're gone. The same thing goes for the yellow pair, where you'll be able to pick them up maybe below their normal retail price, but honestly probably not given their limited edition status, via the first link down below. And as always, if you enjoy the content, drop a like on the video. And if you appreciate the unsponsored, unsugar-coated, brutally honest opinions on this channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025. While we're definitely going to focus on the black leather pair, it is still worth taking a closer look at the yellow ones because I just think they look really good, and it's kind of a cool combination of the OG F50 Adizero graphics and the current F50 graphics, which are already kind of a tribute to that 2010 pair, where obviously you have that signature 2010 F50 Adidas stripes kind of running along the side of the foot, flowing into the ankle area with one of the stripes wrapping around the back. It looks very different because this features the standard modern F50 heel construction, but nonetheless very cool. A giant F50 logo here on the instep, as you'd kind of find on the F50 Plus, but this with obviously a little bit more of that 2010 graphic. It's a bit disappointing that given that this is a yellow synthetic pair, it doesn't have kind of that darker gold rim along the bottom like the original would have had. However, you probably remember Arjen Robben wearing a pair of yellow F50s from the 2010 World Cup, and he wore them in the leather upper variation, which would not have had that rim along the bottom. So I kind of understand why they've done this. And then the sole plate, they've given quite a splash of color in that on the OG, it would have just been a true black. This has that kind of color changing effect that has a little bit of blue, a little bit of orange, a little bit of red, and in general is just really flashy. Also, a really cool detail that doesn't come through in pictures very well are the blue sparkles within the Adidas stripes. As for the leather pair, they are very convincing in terms of looking just like the originals, at least at a quick glance. And obviously the sole plate tooling from the modern F50 isn't too far off the OG, especially with that rounded heel counter, which really does sell the look. But when you take a closer look at an actual original pair, there are a fair few differences. Where if you focus in on all three Adidas logos, one on the tongue, one on the back of the heel tab, and then one here on the inside of the heel, they all have the three stripes with Adidas underneath. Where if you look at the remakes, on the tongue, on the back of the heel, and on the inside of the heel, you just have the three stripes without Adidas written out. You definitely remember the giant F50 logo in yellow here on the instep. However, compared to the original, it's a slightly different size and a completely different font. This, of course, being the OG font and this being the modern F50 logo. The stripes and heel tab on the OG pair are more of a standard yellow, where on the remakes, they have a little bit more of like a golden shine to them. Another small detail that you might remember is the Jabulani microtexturing on the heel liner of the OGs, where if you look at the remakes, the heel liner is a smooth synthetic leather despite having a construction that is true to the original. However, if you look on the back side of the heel, you'll actually find some of that Jabulani texture that is not on the OGs. Why they chose to make these little changes rather than just do a true one-to-one, I'm not entirely sure, but I also kind of like the fact that they made these subtle changes as almost Easter eggs for the true boot nerds out there. As for the performance side of things and physical materials used, I think this is probably the truest one-to-one remake we've ever seen from the Adidas brand, in that obviously it's never going to be exactly the same as the OG. You have to consider that these now came out 14 years ago. Well, I'm really good at math. 15 years ago, so it's going to be nearly impossible to make the leather and build it in exactly the same way, just given how much time has passed. But in all honesty, especially in the way that these feel both in hand as well as on feet, I really don't think that you'd be able to tell a difference between the two. This leather is the same softness, the same thickness, covers the same amount of surface area on the upper, and even with this old school 2010 F50 Adizero heel construction, because of how similar this Sprint Frame 360 sole plate is, even though it is modern, these two football boots could not be more similar, except for a few things. The first of which being the weight, which really was the big deal about the 2010 F50 when it launched, in that it was basically the lightest football boot we had ever seen, whether you went for the synthetic or the leather version. The synthetic model obviously being a little bit lighter, but realistically it was that super lightweight plastic Sprint frame that shaved all the extra weight off, where, as you'll see when compared to this remake, even though it has the same upper, this sole plate isn't quite as light. Keeping in mind this OG pair is a size 9, the remakes I have are a 9.5, so they're a half size bigger, meaning that they're at a little bit of a disadvantage, but nonetheless you'll see the difference. Starting with the OGs, they weigh in at a ridiculously lightweight 5.8 ounces, the equivalent of 165 grams, which means that they are lighter than anything that is currently available in the world of football boots. And then if we throw on the remakes, you'll see that they weigh in at 6.9 ounces, the equivalent of 195 grams, which is obviously still very light. Anything under 200 grams in this size is very impressive, but 30 grams less in the OG pair is just absolutely insane. And again, a huge reason why the F50 Adizero really took off. They genuinely feel weightless. And that's not to say that the new F50 doesn't feel light, but they definitely don't feel as light. But then if you look at the sole plates and stud patterns, there's really not a big difference between the OG and the new ones. But just because you can't see the difference doesn't mean there isn't one. Where, like I mentioned earlier, since these boots came out, 15 years has passed, and technology in the last 15 years has advanced quite a bit, where this plastic sole plate, while ridiculously lightweight, wasn't particularly responsive, and I think perhaps more importantly, also wasn't particularly durable. It's super thin, which means that stud pressure on harder ground was a potential concern in the long run for these incredibly lightweight F50s, and sole plates cracking also wasn't terribly uncommon. It wasn't guaranteed to happen, of course, but if you're going to make a football boot as thin and light as these are, especially with such a thin plastic, you can only expect problems to occur. Where with this new Sprint frame, even though the design itself appears to be very similar, it is more responsive and a heck of a lot more durable, where cracked sole plates in general are much less common to see these days than they were back in 2010. And that's not to take anything away from the OG F50. This Sprint frame sole plate was truly groundbreaking and really the one piece of technology that buried Nike and their super expensive carbon fiber Elite series, in that these were significantly lighter, felt every bit as good, and costed half the price. And that's not even an exaggeration. The Superfly 2 from the 2010 World Cup legitimately retailed for $400. With the stud patterns being, I wouldn't say a major difference, but certainly a noticeable one, in that this 2010 F50 introduced a stud pattern that would basically change all future football boots from the Adidas brand, in that almost everything that they have put out since these were initially released has featured some variation of this stud layout. 4 studs under the heel, 3 on each side of the forefoot, and 1 support stud in the middle. This particular pair featuring all triangular studs that are actually fairly large in profile, meaning that they still can dig into the ground, but the traction I wouldn't say is overly aggressive, and the actual stud length itself was definitely on the longer side for an FG stud pattern. Where, to be brutally honest, I was never a huge fan of this stud pattern, especially compared to other options that were available in the speed category at the time, but because these were just so much lighter than everything else, and in the case of the leather variation, also gave you a leather upper, most people just didn't care. However, the success of that Sprint frame sole plate and stud pattern did not go unrecognized from Adidas, in that they just continued to pump out basically variations of the same thing, where if you look at the F50 that is now available 15 years later, it's still 4 studs under the heel, it's still 3 studs along the outside of the forefoot, 1 support stud in the middle. This one happens to feature an extra one, but you'll of course notice some variation in the stud shape. Blades at the tip of the toe, kind of like a conical stud at the base of the forefoot, and then blades underneath the heel. All with a much smaller profile, meaning that they dig into the ground a lot easier and provide more aggressive traction. And in all honesty, in pretty well every single way, I just think this is better, despite effectively being a variation of the same design. But again, we're led to believe through all the football boot marketing that every new pair is constantly getting better, so I suppose it shouldn't be that surprising that the stud pattern that they have now is at least a little bit better than what they had on offer 15 years ago. But that's about where the differences end, because when it comes to how these remakes fit and feel on feet, they are incredibly similar to the OGs, which is both a good and a bad thing. With the leather upper definitely being the star of the show, in that it's pretty well the same calfskin leather material that at the time they were calling Golio leather. The thickness, the softness, the amount of leather on the foot, the way that it wraps your foot, the off-centered lacing system, and more traditional U-throat construction, even the leather tongue, all feels exactly the same. Is it the most premium leather that you can find out there? No, not necessarily, but the fact that it's on a pair of speed boots is, at the end of the day, what makes these unique, especially back in 2010 and especially on the OGs, given how ridiculously light they were. What Adidas also did really well in recreating is the heel area, which is super low cut with pretty much no extra padding, which was kind of a signature of that OG F50 Adizero, where when you consider how uncomfortable the Mercurial series had been for such a long time, especially their top of the line Superfly 2 that would have been available when these were first released, this was incredibly comfortable compared to the Nike alternative, but by modern standards, I really don't like this no padding, bare bones heel liner and construction. Most of the pressure is kind of in the middle of the heel, basically at the opening of the football boot, which I never really found to be particularly comfortable. And don't get me wrong, I had a pair of OG 2010 leather F50s in the chameleon purple messy colorway, and I absolutely love them. But if we're being brutally honest with ourselves, especially 15 years after the fact, this heel liner is nowhere near as comfortable as the current F50s, and honestly, most modern football boots. So I can appreciate that they've stayed true to the original with the construction of this upper, and it really does give you that experience of an OG pair. But from a comfort perspective, if you're actually going to be playing in these, they're nowhere near as comfortable as they could be, and honestly just nowhere near as comfortable as a lot of other football boots out there. As far as shaping and width is concerned, I'd actually argue that they're pretty similar in width to an OG pair, maybe slightly wider through the midfoot, but in general, that leather, because it's so soft, it wraps around your foot really nicely, and as you wear them in, it's of course going to stretch and mold to the shape of your feet. So as long as you don't have ridiculously wide feet, I think these should work well for most people. The tightest part of this football boot is again going to be that heel area that you may love, you may hate. If you never had a pair of OG 2010 F50s and you're getting a pair of these, you might be surprised at how it feels, because like I said, it's not necessarily pleasant by modern day standards. At least that's what I would argue. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5 US, and the fit and the length is perfect. So if you are looking to get a pair for yourself, just like the normal F50 Elites, I would strongly recommend going true to size in order to achieve the best possible fit. So in conclusion, and I think this pretty much goes without saying, the 2010 World Cup leather F50 remake is pretty much as close to a 10 out of 10 as a remake can possibly get. It's an incredible effort by Adidas and as true to the OG in terms of being a one-to-one remake as I think they could possibly be without giving us the original sole plate and stud pattern. However, if we look at these football boots without being blinded by nostalgia, a more objective point of view, if you will, I'd make the argument that the remake is actually the better overall football boot when compared to the OGs, despite not being quite as light. But given that with this remake, they've opted for the original heel design and construction, I don't think these football boots are as good as they could have been. Where if you really liked this super low cut, no extra padding design from the 2010 Adizero, then these are probably the perfect football boots for you. Unfortunately, I am not one of those people, and I much prefer the current heel construction of the F50 Elite. I just think it's way more comfortable. Had they used that heel design on these, I think this objectively would have been a better football boot, but as it is right now, if I really wanted a leather pair of speed boots for $280, I'd still go for a made in Japan Mizuno Morelia 4, the non-beta variation, or honestly, even the $180 Copa Icon 2 isn't a bad option. Where don't get me wrong, these are super cool and absolutely one of the GOATs, and if you want a pair, you should definitely get them. But to suggest that this is the best leather speed boot currently on the market, even if Adidas were to continue to produce these and make them readily available, I just don't think that's the case.